From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Library of Congress and three of our divisions, the European Division, the Hispanic Division, and the Poetry and Literature Center, I would like to welcome you to the library for this exciting event. This evening, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Nobel Prize-winning Greek poet, Odysseas Elytis. First, though, I would like to introduce, with my special pleasure, to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Vasilis Kaskarelis, the Ambassador of Greece to the United States in 2009. And I would like to invite him to say a few words to our guests. The embassy has graciously co-sponsored this event with us. Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me. I'm much honored and really pleased to represent Greece in such a monumental institution that serves the world's community of knowledge with its broad and multiple collections in a plethora of fields. Its mission to support the Congress in fulfilling its constitutional duties and to further the progress of knowledge and creativity for the benefit of the American people goes much beyond and not only serves the international community, but also it encourages collaborations, such as the one of this evening, to enhance cross-cultural communication and dialogue. Today's celebration of Greece's literature Nobel Laureate in literature, Odysseas Elytis, and his influence to the Hispanic world represents an excellent paradigm. It is actually the culmination of an outstanding collaboration that was built through time between the experts of the library's European and Hispanic divisions, Georgette Dorn and Harold Leigh, to whom we are grateful, and the Embassy of Greece on the other hand. As for Elytis, we Greeks are not only proud that he won the highest of the world distinctions, but also for opening up the horizons of communication and exchanges with international communities, and especially the Hispanic one, that is very dear to our hearts and close to our culture. Greek people came closer to the Hispanic world through the arts and letters, and especially literature and music. On this auspicious occasion, I would like to address my thanks to the protagonists of this wonderful initiative. Greece appreciates greatly this genuine expression of interest and friendship by the Library of Congress and the academic and literary communities. In particular, I would like to thank Professor Pedro Serrano and Ray Berroa, both poets and critics, who are the speakers of this evening and who will help us appreciate and better understand the inspirational exchanges between our two cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The library collaborated with the Greek Embassy in December of last year on another special event commemorating Elytis' birthday in 1911. Harry Leik, the Russian and Greek specialist of the European Division, brought some rare first editions of Elytis at the embassy. In doing the research for the exhibit, Harry discovered that many Elytis' poems have been translated into Spanish, many shortly after they were first published in Greek. This was frankly a surprise and raises some interesting questions. Why specifically Elytis? Why was he so popular in the Spanish-speaking world and so widely published in Spanish translation, not only in Spain itself, but also in Latin America? We don't know all the answers, of course, but we hope that this evening's presentations will start the dialogue and lead to further research and insights into connections between the Hellenic and Hispanic cultures. This topic also points out one of the chief goals of the Library of Congress and its collections. We make them available as primary source materials for the study of cultural connections and interrelationships, many of which may have been unnoticed or less than obvious previously. We invite you all to avail yourselves to the library's magnificent collections and the services and expertise of our staff as you investigate topics in Hellenic and Hispanic subjects. I would now like to introduce Pedro Serrano, Mexican poet who was born in Montreal. He studied at the University of Mexico and the University of London. He has published 5 books of poems. With Carlos Lopez Beltran, he edited and translated La Generación del Cordero, The Lamb Generation, a bilingual anthology of contemporary British poetry, and also an anthology of the Irish poet Matthew Sweeney. He translated Shakespeare's King John. Serrano's Canciones Lunáticas, with music by Hilda Paredes, were performed in London and in Paris. His poems have appeared in Modern Poetry in Translation, Verse, Sirena, The Rialto, The Wheelbarrow, and many others. His newest book about modern poetry, focusing on T.S. Eliot and Octavio Paz, is in press. Serrano received the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2007. He's based at the National University of Mexico, but currently he's teaching poetry and translation at Georgetown University. Pedro Serrano.
Well, first, thanks to the Library of Congress, thanks to the organizer, and thanks to the ambassador and the Greek embassy. Por aquí. I'm going to tell a story. I was, before we started, we were talking, and I was about history and poetry, and there is a point in which, if we are talking about poetry and history, after some decades, you become kind of part of it. So I'm going to tell part of that story about Elytis especially in Mexico, no? And let me organize this a bit, in order that they don't fall. I first met Elytis in Mexico because, well, there's one very interesting thing. There are 2 Mexican poets that were ambassadors in Greece, no? One was Jaime García Terrés, and the other one was Hugo Gutiérrez Vega. So that is one of the reasons why we in Mexico have so many contacts with Greek poetry. And when I was studying at the University of Mexico, there was Hugo Gutiérrez Vega, who later on was going to be ambassador, was the director of the the Department of art and literature diffusion. I mean, in the university, and he was editing some little pamphlets. That these are 2 examples of them. One is by Elytis, that were sold in the outside the university. So they were very cheap, and so when one went and bought it costed, I don't know, 20 pesos, which was at the time was nothing, the same price of a coffee. And so that's why, in that way, I started reading a lot of poets. For example, for telling you this, Elytis was 96, and in that series, which has every 20 issues of the it was called Material de Lectura, Serie Poesía Moderna, which is reading material, modern poetry. And so in this 21, so there was Ferreira de Luanda, a Brazilian poet, Cesar Vallejo, a Peruvian poet, an anthology of contemporary poetry from Japan, etc., etc. No? So was one of the ways in which I started knowing poetry. In not only Mexican poetry that I was able to read in the magazines and in classes, learning of, but also some other poets that I had never ever known before. So, there is a good place to put it. So in this sense, my intervention is going to have an autobiographical twist, no? As I said, there's a moment in life in which historical things come to you not only as external experience, no? They are not only something that we learned from, but things that happened to you. Because then, 2 years later, in 1979, I started working in that department. And so, for example, I opened I hadn't for ages seen this little pamphlet, I must confess, until I came back to Elytis. And then I noticed that the two people who were kind of proofing it were Javier Sicilia and Pablo Mora. Both are Mexican poets, quite well known. Javier Sicilia is becoming a very important political figure, not political in the sense of a representative, but a social figure, because in this moment in Mexico of the kind of war, as they are calling it, and an open figure writing. I'm not going to tell all this story about him, but he was editing it. Then I started looking for I was here, but I asked a friend of me to send me the books I had in Mexico of Elytis, and then I traced all the publishings of Greek poetry in Mexico. The Elytis, I think this pamphlet was published in 1983. But first, there was the first book afterward was a book called Poesía Griega Moderna, Modern Greek Poetry, by a translator called Carmen Chouaki, no, who was the one who did, together with another translator, this book. It was Carmen Chouaki and Natalia Moreleon. I'm going to mention all the translators because I think translators are a very important part of the way we are able to know a poet in another language. Because poetry, I think, is like the visual arts. I mean, we know a painter, and we don't need to have a translation of the painter. No, we have the painting in itself, and we are able to get into that. But if we don't have translators, we don't have the possibility of getting to know other poets in our own language. No? So translators are as important as poets themselves, I think. Not only because I do translations, but no, I mean, I can tell you something. Well, I did this anthology of British poets, and most of them, many of them were friends of mine. But because at the time I was not translated into English, they weren't able to read, except if they speak Spanish, they weren't able to read my own poem. So it was a kind of, which doesn't happen to painters. No, if you have a painter here and a painter in front of him, they don't even have to talk in order to talk. No. So there was this book that was an anthology of poetry, Greek modern poetry, published in 1986, and then in 1993 there was another anthology, Antología de la Poesía. This was the Poesía Moderna Griega, no, that was published in 83. Then in 86 there was this Antología de la Poesía Griega del siglo XX that was done by Rigas Capatos, Carlos Montemayor, another Mexican poet. Ah, no te conocía. Nice to meet you. Well, you know this book.
Yeah. I saw the white mane there. Rigas is my, we say my tocayo. Tocayo is the person that has the same name, only that his name is in Greek and mine is in Spanish.
Well, so you know all the story I'm going to.
It's
No,
fabulous.
that's fabulous. Yes.
Yeah.
And so these are the two main anthologies, and the ones that I have. There is another one called Once Poetas Griegos, which is this one. No, it's not this one. It's this one. That was actually promoted, I think, by Hugo Gutiérrez Vega, and it was made by different translators. In Mexico, we have two ways of getting to know contemporary Greek poetry. One is the people who study Greek at the university, classic Greek, that then moves to contemporary, to modern, either because they live there or because they know people, or because they are interested not only in the classic Greek world, but also in the contemporary reality of Greece. And so they are some of the translators of Greek poetry into Spanish. And the others are people who have lived there or went to there. One of them, which is very, very important, is Francisco Torres Córdoba, who has translated many, many things by Elytis. And he's a poet of my generation. He studied at the university with me. We were not very close friends, I must say, but we respect each other. and he went when Hugo Gutiérrez Vega was ambassador in Greece, he invited him to go there and study Greek, contemporary Greek, and started translating him. And I mean, I'm close to that because Hugo Gutiérrez Vega was my first boss, so and I like him a lot, no? So it's part of that's why it's part of my personal history. So the books I'm showing to you are books not only that I knew because I looked to them in libraries or because I went to a bookshop and bought them, but because I was in touch with them, I was in touch with the people who were translating them. I was kind of in the same mood, and it has to do with Elytis, with the way Elytis saw poetry, the way Elytis built up himself as a poet in the 30s with the generation of poets and with the magazine in which he was publishing at the time. There is, where is it? This book that has just come and I didn't know. It's called in Spanish Crónica de una década. I don't know how it was, because my Greek is not the best, I must confess. And it's a marvelous story of the chronicle of 10 years, the 10 years between 35 and 45, in which Elytis began to be a poet, and all the things that happened to him, how he met Seferis, how he met his friends, how was life in Athens. And there, at the time he wrote this kind of, I can't say in Greek. It's a poem on a friend of him who died during the war. No. You can. Here's in Greek.
Yes, you
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I would love to.
The last lieutenant in Albania during the war of Albania.
Yes, he died in Albania. His friend, he was a young poet, and he wrote two marvelous pages on him. in this book that I recommend you in English or in Greek or in Spanish. Then, well, when in the Material de Lectura there were four poets published. One was the first one was Seferis, because he was friends of Jaime García Terrés. No, that was the first Material de Lectura published. And I remember reading that poem, reading some of those poems translated by García Terrés that are called Three Secret Poems, that are lovely. And remember, I mean, talking with friends in the same way as Elytis was talking with his friends in the 30s in bars, talking with friends about this girlfriend of one of us and saying, this is this Helen, an uninhabited tunic or something like that. No, so I remember very well that lines. And actually, this friend of mine, who is Francisco Segovia, is together with another translator of Greek, who is Selman Sira, who is a great translator from Greek and Russian. He's doing Seferis poems, complete poems, into Spanish or into Mexican, I don't know. So Seferis was the first. No, there's no difference. I'm joking, because the French tend to say translated from Spanish, Mexico or Mexican. It's like saying translated from Greek, Cypriot, or translated from English, Texan. No. Well, and because of him, Seferis is very, very. I mean, there are a lot of books that all his essays are translated and are called the Greek stylish. But it's a very, very interesting thing that I want to stress, the way the name was called in Spanish. Because one other thing that I found is that both in English and in Spanish, there are first university presses, the ones who published poetry, and then small poetry presses. No, for example, in Spanish there are two. One is El Tucán de Virginia, who published this and this and this, also by Elytis, and Ediciones Sin Nombre, which is another small publishing press that publishes mainly poetry, which published this new book. And in English, it's also the university presses that publish his complete works, or, for example, Copper Canyon, which is not a big publishing press, that publishes his poems. No, well, it was Seferis the first, then Kavafis, obviously, but because he's the most well-known poet from Greece, I would say. And then Ritsos was the third, and then Elytis was the fourth. No, and so after that we have first the Material de Lectura, was published, I think, in 80. It doesn't have the date, but 81, 82. Then a book of poems in translation by a Chilean, Miguel Castillo Didier. I'm mentioning the translators because that a poet starts writing and starts publishing, and publishes a poem in a magazine, a poem in another magazine. And the people who read that poem doesn't read the whole work. That's studied at university. And then you read a poem in a language. No? But poets do not write only in a language. Poets write in the world, write in the languages they know, and in the languages they can read in translation into their own language. No? So when Elytis was writing, he was writing in Greek, and he knew French, and he knew other languages. But the people who was reading him poem by poem. In the same way, I happened to know him as a poet. I didn't study him at all. I read some poems, and then because there was people who was interested in and making an effort on translating him, and because there were people who was making an effort on publishing him, because you know that poetry is not a kind of item, a commercial item. So it's because of all that effort that we have an elite that is part of Mexican culture and of Spanish-speaking culture, no? And that I think that is very important. So what I wanted to just to show you how it came into Mexico. Very briefly, I'm just going to say there was then this book, the one I showed you, that was translated in '99. This that is a marvelous book of essays. Before everything, poetry and the girls, or no. In '99, then where is it? Well, I think I didn't bring it. Solo el primero. Ah, no, that I don't have it. Sorry. Solo el primero by Natalia Moreleon in 2000. Then 6 essays. I don't have it also. Translated by Francisco Torres Córdoba in 2001. Then El Monograma. I don't know how to say that in Greek. Monogrammas, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I thought it was Spanish. El Monograma. One other thing that is very interesting, 2 of the most important poets in Mexico that come from Greek, who studied Greek. One is Bonifaz Nuño, who translated the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in a marvelous translation, because he reproduces the way people criticizes him because it's as if you were reading Greek, not Spanish. But that's the way if you make a little effort, you get into the rhythm, you get into the construction, and you are reading in Spanish something that is half Spanish, half Greek, and that becomes Spanish. And that happens in English with the Bible translated by the King James Bible. It was written in an English that was forced to fit into the what? Sorry, la lengua, into the Hebrew. Sorry. So, and he, the one interesting thing, and the other one was the one that translated him, Carlos Montemayor. Well, Carlos Montemayor, who recently died, after studying Greek, started working on contemporary languages from Mexico, not Spanish, but the other languages. And Bonifaz Nuño started writing poems about the pre-Hispanic heritage in Mexico. So in a way, I suppose they kind of saw a link between his own interests and the things they saw in Greece to the way he saw Mexico. And I think that it has to do with something that happens with Elytis. Elytis is all the time thinking about a Greece that goes back to 4,000 years, sorry, and comes back to the present. But as the translator of him into English says, Greece for him was the world, no? Was not only Greece, but was the world. And in that sense, Greece is part of all of us. And well, shall I read a poem now, or do it? Leemos al final?
No,
Yeah?
yes. Yeah, it would make more sense to read it now. We are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to read a poem in Spanish. Elena. How it's called in Greek? But in Spanish, we can either write it with an H or without an H, no? And one other interesting thing, Odysseas Elytis, his first translations into Spanish was called Odiseo. Yeah. And it's until after several translations that becomes Odysseas. And the same happened in English. It was Odysseus, and then now it's Odysseas, which I think is the right way of naming him. Well, Elena. I have a translation, I read it in Spanish. Con la primera gota de lluvia fue asesinado el verano. Se empaparon las palabras que habían engendrado las estrellas, todas las palabras que te tenían a ti como única destinataria. Ahí donde tenderemos nuestros brazos ahora ya no nos mide el tiempo. Ahí donde dejaremos nuestros ojos ahora que las cartas distantes navegan hacia las nubes. Ahora que se cierran tus párpados sobre nuestros paisajes y estamos como si entre nosotros hubiera niebla, solos y solitarios rodeados de tus inanimadas imágenes. Con la frente apoyada en la ventana contemplamos la nueva pesadumbre. No es la muerte la que nos arrojará a esa pesadumbre donde tú existes, esa que existe en otro lugar, un viento que te viva entera, para que te vista de cerca como te viste desde lejos nuestra esperanza, esa que existe en otro lugar, llanura verdísima que se extiende desde tu risa hasta el sol, diciéndole confidencialmente cómo nos volveríamos a encontrar. No, no es la muerte la que enfrentaremos en medio de tantas gotas de lluvia otoñal, una turbia sensación, el olor de la tierra húmeda dentro de nuestras almas que se alejan tanto y cada vez más. Y como no está tu mano en nuestras manos, y como no está nuestra sangre en las venas de tus sueños, la luz en el cielo inmaculado y la música invisible dentro de nosotros, oh melancólica, que dejas atrás cuanto nos detiene todavía en el mundo, en el aire húmedo la hora de partida del otoño, el amargo apoyo de los codos en el recuerdo que sale cuando la noche nos separa de la luz, detrás de la ventana cuadrada que ve hacia la tristeza, que no ve nada, porque se convierte de todas maneras en una apasionada música, invisible en el familiar tic-tac del gran reloj de pared, porque de todas maneras se convierte el verso de un poema en otro verso, clamor paralelo a la lluvia, las lágrimas, las palabras, palabras que no son como las otras, sino que tienen una sola destinataria, tú. Vale. I think that's right.
That was very beautiful. Thank you very much. Really, really beautiful. And I'm so glad Ray Berroa made it, despite the terrible traffic. So it is now indeed a great pleasure to introduce Ray Berroa, who was born in the Dominican Republic. He is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, where he received a PhD in Spanish literature. He teaches literature and literary criticism at George Mason University since 1984. He has published over 30 books of poetry, literary criticism, and poetry anthologies in Argentina, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, India, Mexico, Spain, the United States, and Venezuela. His book, Otredades, published in Zamora in 2010, was one of the 10 books declared as recommended reading for 2011 by the Association of Book Editors of Spain. Since 1992, he coordinates the Teatro de la Luna's Poetry Marathon. In 2009, he was awarded the Médaille de Vermeil by the French Academy of Arts, Sciences, and Letters, and received in December of 2011 the Trieste International Poetry Award, a prize given to a poet in recognition for his or her lifetime achievement in poetry. Under the sponsorship of the Department of State, he is now directing a study in the United States for students of Bolivia, Paraguay, and Peru. And he will talk about Elytis, a metaphysics of light.
Yes, it's a very convenient space. My apologies for being late. As Georgette said, I am directing a grant with the State Department at George Mason University for future young leaders of Latin America. And we met the other day with Sonia Sotomayor, which is, for us, is like, how did we do it? And it was so fascinating that I sent Justice Sotomayor. I learned to say Justice Sotomayor and not Sonia. A little description of the program because she wanted to know. So after making an introduction to the students, suddenly she turns to me and she says, Professor Berroa, when you were their age, had you been already identified as a future leader? And I said, no, of course, I was trying to survive in the Dominican Republic. And she said, me too. So you guys have a tremendous responsibility. Don't let your society down. And that began a session on question and answer. So today we spend the day at the mall, and then after taking the students back to George Mason, I have to run to the house, change, and be here. And I'm very glad that I am here. Thank you for inviting me, Georgette, Rob. I made it. Mr. Ambassador Rigas, qué placer tenerte aquí, hermano. Yeah, era justo. I am going to begin in a different, perhaps in a different mood. I'm going to begin with a poem. I'm going to begin with a poem in order to sort of make some calisthenics, another Greek word. Those of you that know me from before, and I see at least two, know that I use a lot of, I learned classic Greek in order to be able to read the classic poets, and that has given me an immense joy because I can joke with the students occasionally and show them some classic connection between the world they live in and the world they do not know and don't have any interest in. So I'm going to read a poem. Should I read it first in Spanish and then in English, or first in English and then in Spanish? Whatever. English first, that way. And the reason is because we are, I think that we are a mixed group of three languages here, English, Spanish, and obviously Greek. And my Greek doesn't go that far to read a poem of Elytis. The Mad Pomegranate Tree. In these bright white courtyards where the south wind blows, whistling through vaulted arches, tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who leaps in light, scattering her fruitful laugh, with wind's stubbornness and whispering? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who quivers the dawn with foliage newborn, opening all her colors aloft with a shiver of triumph? When in awakening fields naked girls harvest clover with blonde hands, roaming the ends of their sleep, tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who unsuspecting places lights in their burden baskets, who overflows their names with bird song? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who fights the world's cloudy skies? On the day that jealousy adorns herself with 7 kinds of feathers, girding the eternal sun with 1,000 of blinding prisms, tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who running seizes a mane with 100 lashes, never sad and never grumbling? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who shouts the new hope now dawning. Tell me, is it the pomegranate tree who greets the expanse, fluttering a leaf handkerchief of cool fire, a sea about to give birth to 1,000 ships, with waves that 1,000 times move and go to unscented shores? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who creaks the rigging aloft in pellucid ether, very high with the glaucous sky cluster that lights and celebrates, proud, full of danger? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who mid-world breaks the demon storm with light, who spreads from end to end the saffron bib of day, richly embroidered with songs? Tell me, is it the mad pomegranate tree who hastily unhooks the silks of day? In petticoats of April 1st and cicadas of August 15th, tell me, she who plays, she who rages, she who seduces, casting off from thread its evil black glooms, pouring intoxicating birds on the sun's bosom, tell me, she who opens her wings on the breast of things, on the breast of our deep dreams, is it the mad pomegranate tree? Y ahora en español. ¿Ah? The translator is Carson. It's the is the author, translated by Jeffrey Carson and Nikos Sarris. This is probably well, not probably. This is this was the first collected poems of Elytis in any language, including Greek, published by Johns Hopkins University in 1974, I think it was the first edition, 1997. So let me read the poem in Spanish now. I'll try to, and I try to create the flow with the language, because otherwise, and as my new friend and colleague was saying, you know, without the translators, we live in a very small world. I teach a class on translation, and the students realize after, I would say, the third week, that the translator has to be a poet in order to translate a poem. Not necessarily a poet in the sense that we think, but it has to get into the mind of the poet, into the mind of the lyric voice that speaks in the poem, in order to give the reader the triple perception and create something totally new. And they learn to appreciate the job of the poet. After the third week, they begin telling me, you know, I would never denigrate ever again what the translator does. La traducción, the translation of this text in Spanish is by Miguel Castillo Didier, in the edition that came out in Monte Ávila in 1991. And I would say that Mexico first and Monte Ávila and Venezuela second through Monte Ávila were the two places where Elytis was really began to be known in the Spanish world. In Spain, it was, well, you know, during the Franco regime, it was very hard to reach anything that was not Spanish. Excuse me. En estos patios blanquísimos en que sopla el viento sur, silbando en arcos abovedados, decidme, Es el granado enloquecido que vibra a la luz desparramando su risa frutal con porfías y silbidos del viento. Decidme, es el granado enloquecido que palpita a la alborada con follajes recién brotados, desplegando todos los colores en lo alto con un temblor de triunfo. Cuando en los campos que despiertan las muchachas desnudas ciegan los tréboles con sus manos rubias, recorriendo los confines de sus sueños, decidme, ¿es el granado enloquecido que velando coloca las luces en sus cestos verdes, que hace desbordar sus nombres de trinos? Decidme, ¿es el granado enloquecido que combate con las nubes del mundo? En el día que por envidia se adorna con alas de 7 clases, ciñendo el sol eterno con 1000 prismas enceguecedores, decidme, ¿es el granado enloquecido que se coge una crinera con 100 fustas en plena carrera, nunca entristecido y nunca quejoso? Decidme, ¿es el granado enloquecido que grita la nueva esperanza que amanece? Decidme, es el granado enloquecido que saluda a la distancia, agitando un pañuelo de hojas de fresco fuego, una mar presta a dar a luz con incontables navíos, con olas que se marchan innumerables veces a costas inodoras. Decidme, es el granado enloquecido que hace rechinar los mástiles en la altura del diáfano éter. Muy alto, con el racimo azulado que se enciende y festeja, arrogante, pleno de peligros, decidme, es el granado enloquecido que hace estallar con luz en medio del mundo las intemperies del demonio, que despliega de extremo a extremo el collar azafranado del día, profusamente recamado de canciones. Decidme, es el granado enloquecido que deprisa desabotona los vestidos de seda del día. En enaguas de primeros de abril y en cigarras de mediados de agosto, decidme, este que juega, que se enfurece, que seduce, sus malas tinieblas oscuras por la amenaza vaciando en los senos del sol las aves embriagadoras, decidme, este que extiende las alas sobre el pecho de las cosas en el pecho de nuestros profundos ensueños, ¿es el granado enloquecido? I wanted to begin with a poem, because as poets and as poet, we live in a different world than the world we live as human beings, and than the world we live as literary critics or professor. It's essential that we dig into this space, this ethereal space, with the poet in our head, not just with the name of the poet, but with his words. And I'm going to say a few words about this metaphysics of light that and that's what I suggested to Georgette, that I was going to touch a few ideas about the poet and the Greek poetry in general, and how it reached our world in English, and also mention a little bit about completing what Felipe had just said. Felipe, ¿no? Pedro. No sé de dónde saqué yo Felipe. Pedro, muchas gracias. The endeavor to follow several contemporary literatures, which is something that we do constantly. I imagine that Pedro does it, and everyone does it here, not just. And the fact is that we cannot read everything, and it's so frustrating. You would like to know all the poets that are writing in your language, in French, in Italian. I was in Italy in December and met a number of poets. I have not heard anything, and it feels so bad that you cannot because it has become such a secluded world with the elimination of bookstores, especially the little bookstores, and less the students go to the library to do research because they think that Google is everything, and you have to insist. It's not just that the books are there; it's also the ambiance, the smell of the printed word. So this endeavor to follow several contemporary literatures does not result in an increasingly unwieldy aggregate of names, but rather the opposite. The more literatures one studies, the shorter is the list of the essential authors who can, in a way, withstand the constant comparison that we establish between the poets that we know and the poets that we learn about. There are people that have said that there is no need to exalt a poet because it happens to write in your native language and period. When you are aware that a first-rate poet in another literature is doing the same thing and much better and much more beautiful. And this is what we call the misguided patriotism many times. Misguided patriotism due to linguistic parochialism vitiates more than one overblown literary reputation. There is a Lithuanian poet, Henrikas Radauskas, that formulated what appears to be a veritable law of literary physics. The smaller the country, the fatter the anthology. And one might add somewhat facetiously, the more geniuses per square mile. And you can take it, and you see it in the Dominican Republic, and you see it in. I mean, it happens everywhere, without diminishing the value of the people that are really creating something of value. Yet there are exceptionally created marginal literatures and insufficiently translated major poets in many languages. What is therefore more needed than ever now is the continuous critical exploration of the entire contemporary literary spectrum, which would entail challenge and recognition of universally valid achievement wherever they are realized. And I get into this, into the Greek example. There is no denying the scope and depth of the Greek literary renaissance in the 20th century, particularly in the field of poetry. Konstantin Tripanis claims with authority in the introduction to his pioneering Penguin Book of Greek Verse, poetry written in Greek constitutes the longest uninterrupted tradition in the Western world. From Homer to the present day, not a single generation of Greeks has lived without expressing its joys and sorrows in verse, and frequently in verse of outcasting originality, depth, and beauty. It is a happy augury that in the last 100 years, better poetry has been written in Greek than in all the 14 preceding centuries. And that in the last 50 years, 70 years, Greek poetry has again achieved universal validity and significance. Although Tripanis' selection spans close to 3 millennia from Odysseas Elytis, from Homer to Odysseas Elytis, it is understandable that these last 75 years can hardly be exhaustively presented in such a vast context. So the English-speaking reader is fortunate to be able to supplement it with Kimon Fryer's massive modern Greek poetry from Kavafis to Elytis, which presents 30 poets on 780 pages. There is also Edmund Keeley and Philip Sierrar's earlier 6 poets of modern Greece, which offers a more limited selection. The latter 2 translators have reduced their choice even further in their 4 Greek poets, which includes Kavafis, Seferis, Elytis, and Gatsos. Not wanting to miss for a moment the complete modern Greek poetic landscape as traced by Fryer, I personally feel most convinced from a comparative perspective, though, of the major status of 3 outstanding peaks: Kavafis, or Kavafi, Seferis, and Elytis. The English-speaker reader who wants to become acquainted with these 3 great Greek poets is again in a uniquely favored position, since almost their entire poetic production is available in reliable translations, often in exemplary bilingual editions. Something that, unfortunately, I cannot say that we have. I just received the complete works of Walt Whitman, translated by a translation by Alexandre. I think it is an Ecuadorian poet, I think it was, and Bisor decided to take all the poetry and publish it. But it is very hard to convince publishers that poetry is essential for the human growth. In English, we are fortunate to have this possibility. Kavafis, the poet from Alexandria, is even accessible in 3 collected editions. I just mentioned the 3 of them: the poems of C.P. Kavafi by John Mavrocordato, Ray Dalben's The Complete Poems of Kavafi, and Keeley and Sherrard's new translation, the most complete and easily the best that is available, I think, of the collected poems published by Princeton. As to Greece's first Nobel Prize winner in 1963, Smyrna-born Seferis, when I went to Smyrna, I went to Crete, and woe me looking for Elytis, without knowing anything if he was going to be in Heracles, and the people said, no, he lives in Athens. He has been living in Athens for many years. So at least I said, well, at least I tried. And the same thing when I went to Smyrna in 2008 in a poetry festival organized by the city of Smyrna. And for a poet to be invited to Smyrna, the birth of Homer, it's just like for any religious person to go to Jerusalem or to Mecca or to Rome. And I went looking for again, trying to convince my friends if I could go and see Seferis' house, which we did. We have Keeley Sherrard's bilingual volume Collected Poems and Walter Kaiser's translation of the later 3 secret poems. And an interested reader can even further consult the King of Assign versions by Bernard Spencer, Nanos Balaoritis, and Lawrence Durrell, etc. And we are going to, and obviously, until 1974, poems by Elytis were available in English translation only in anthologies and different literary journals. But as Pedro said before, the literary journals give a glimpse of what the poet is doing, because normally the journal publishes what the poet is writing now, not what the poet wrote before. And so you have a very skimpy glimpse at what the poet is about. But at least there were some things. Until in 1974, this changed suddenly through an almost simultaneous publication of two books, both of them in Pennsylvania, one in Pittsburgh and the one in Philadelphia. Fryer's general selection of poems from the years 35-73, The Sovereign Son, which I brought with me to show the publication, and published by Temple University, and immediately after that, the complete version of one of Elytis' most memorable longer poems. They write the Action Esti, I think it is Action. Yeah, it's Action. Published by my alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh, and with a presentation by Halo, the person at the university who directed the poetry series at the university. The work was translated by Edmund Keeley and George Savidis. Since Elytis was just as accomplished an essayist as Seferis, his ideas on the poetic are as essential to understand the man and his world as is his poetry. And in 1994, a selection of his open papers, selected essays, appeared in paperback translation, translated by Olga Brumas and T. Begley, followed in 1997 by Eros, 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 which included poems and a succulent selection of his essays, a package of 275 pages that finally made the poet known. And obviously, as I mentioned before, in 1997, the Johns Hopkins University Press published the first complete collections of poems of Elytis in any language, including Greek, which is this book that I have here. It should be evident from the foregoing that the interested reader has available in English the full panorama of Greek poetry in the 20th century, complete with major and minor figures. Three masters of universal fame, Kavafis, Seferis, and Elytis, are accessible in indisputable complete editions. Hardly any other literature of a small nation has fared so well in English as has the poetry of modern Greece. Today, we gather here at the Library of Congress, of all places. I should say that I would like to proclaim that this is my alma mater, since I want to spend so much time here in spite of all the petty things that I have to do at the university, to celebrate and render tribute to a poet that has become, I think, Greece's Rilke, Greece's Vallejo, Greece's Lorca, Greece's Baudelaire. I met Elytis' poetry one day in the fall of 1977, at the house of Vicente Alexandri. Carlos Busoño was my maestro and my mentor at the International Institute in Madrid. I was studying with Middlebury College. Middlebury College has a campus in Madrid, in Florence, in München. A few weeks before, Busoño had told me to read Miguel Hernández, a poet that I knew only from Serrat's songs, because Busoño said, there is something in your poetry that makes you need to read Miguel Hernández. A poet that later was going to become the source of income for my life, because I wrote my dissertation, I wrote my master thesis on Miguel Hernández, and then my doctoral dissertation at the University of Pittsburgh. So I really owe Miguel Hernández my house, my car, and that's the truth, because I don't think I would have been able to get my job if I had not done that. Busoño was perhaps the most authoritative poet and critic on Alexandri. So, wandering through the vast bookshelves in Alexandra's library, a book caught my attention because it had a Latin title, Dignum Est. Later, I was going to learn that the title was really Toatian Esti, worth it is. After reading a couple of poems, the book was in French, I asked Vicente to let me borrow the book and spend days reading those poems. I went to the National Library in Madrid and just dig into, obviously with a French dictionary. And the book was not Greek and French, which I would have preferred, because that I always do that to compare and also to force myself to read the text in the original language. Toatio Esti. Having studied Vicente's poetry with Busogno, I could not believe how similar these two poets were in their profuse celebration of light and sea. I could not return Alexandra's book because about 2 weeks after that marvelous encounter in his house, Alexander was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature and was impossible to reach him for quite some time, which I loved because I could soak myself in Elytis' Toatio Esti. I tried to find as much as I could by him, although not much was available in the Spanish world at that time. So when 2 years after that it was Elytis' turn to receive the Nobel Prize, we could read in newspaper. Well, I said this, repeating that the country that was way ahead of all the other countries in the Spanish-speaking world was Mexico, mainly, I guess, as you said, Pedro, because of the ambassadors that had been in Greece and could bring what was of note to Mexico. I imagine that the ambassadors Spain had were perhaps military figures, and they were not interested perhaps in reading anything that was not. So I tried by all means to get to go and find in whatever language I could about Elytis, because that's what happens when you find a gold mine. It's like when you, and it is with everything, you know. We say that money brings more money, no? But knowledge brings more knowledge. And when you realize that you know so little about something and you want to learn more, the more you learn, the more you realize that you are an ignorant. We could read in newspapers across the continent, and I brought an example here. We could read in newspapers across the continent when the prize was finally given to Elytis. Something similar to what this newspaper from Argentina, El Día, who published the news. Odysseas Elytis, nuevo premio Nobel de Literatura. I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but it's a little funny to read the perception of the. You let me know if when it's time to, because I don't want to, and I imagine that we will also want to, I want to hear what Rigas and the ambassador and anybody else have to say about it. The article says that they gave him the prize because he was a noted poet of the Greek resistance. The Swedish Academy motivates its decision in that the poet, 68 years of age, reaches with his poetry or is able to give life to the struggle of modern man for freedom and constant creativity. That's, he says, whoever wrote this, is because he was an anti-fascist. Don't forget that we are in 1979 and something is going on very serious in October of that year in Argentina. So the whole the Malvinas issue was being cooked. The poet, who has a reputation of being too introverted, every time they try to, comes from a family of soap makers from Crete, and continue such and such. Among the names that circulated with strength as possible recipients of the prize were Jorge Luis Borges, which we all agree, I think, that it was an overlook that shouldn't have happened, and the English Graham Greene. They talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was going to get it just 3 years after that, and the British writer Doris Lessing, who got it just, 4 years ago? At the age of 80-something, she said, "Why do they give me a prize now?" She said, "I don't need it." Why don't they give you the prize when you can use the money? Another name that, and they mention another name, but the point is Borges. The writer Jorge Luis Borges, who has been mentioned as a candidate 15 times, told to the radio, "I don't really deserve this prize. I consider something that is a tradition in my life, that every year during the last 15 years, they tell me that I am there. I know they will not give it to me. And in this moment, I just am resigned to receiving it. I don't know Elytis, but I am really happy that he's Greek." Borges, all his dream was to become a Roman citizen. And I don't know why the Italians didn't give him the citizenship. And the whole article talks about how the Swedish Academy is not interested in our writers because our writers do not follow their political stance. And this was the norm. When you don't know something, instead of recognizing that you don't know, and you go there to know, then you diminish the other. And I learned that when Elytis, because I had just arrived to the United States, and many of my friends, Colombian, 2 Argentinians, several countries from Latin America, I remember having the same reaction. We don't know who he is. And I said, well, isn't this a good reason to know who he is? Nowadays, we know, as I said before, that his essays gathered in the open book constituted an essential part of his oeuvre, in which the poetic element was fused with autobiographical reflections and objective evaluation interpretations. Purely scholarly elucidations did not interest Elytis. He was rather skeptical about how soon Greek readers and critics would fully grasp the message of his essays, because they were written out of the mainstream of critical discourse, and nevertheless they read as poems themselves. And I'm just going to get into some of them. In one of those essays, he says, 557, in Greece, light and history are one and the same thing, meaning that in the final analysis, the one reproduces the other, the one interprets and justifies the other, even the void, which is blackness. For this country, by offering equality of ethical and physical values, does not happen to know any other chiaroscuro. light and history, sea and life. Elytis' notion of natural objects expresses a certain ethos, I should say, that varies according to the geographical region and language within which they are represented. A bare mountain, for instance, may suggest simplicity and leanness. Fragrant herbs may suggest innocence. Lime talks about purification and candor, while a shining drop of water may bring forth diaphaneity, a very difficult word to pronounce in English. This is not. Is it how you say diaphaneity?
Diaphania.
Well, yeah, it comes from diaphania, no, but in English, diaphaneity, a term that is expressively pervasive in his poetry. Even at his Nobel address, he begins with this concept. May I be permitted, please, to speak in the name of luminosity and diaphaneity? Because these qualities define the place in which I was destined to grow up and to live. And I gradually felt them become identified in me with the need for expression. It is right to bring to one's art those things that personal experience and the virtues of language dictate. This is even more so when times are dark and thus oblige one to widen one's vision as much as possible. I do not speak of the physical ability to conceive objects with all their details, but of the metaphorical ability to catch their essence and lead them to a clarity that also intimates their metaphysical semasiology. The way sculptures of the Cycladic period handled matter so that they went beyond matter shows this clearly. Or the way Byzantine icon painters succeeded with pure color in suggesting the divine. We have to look for Heraclitus and Longinus in Elytis' work. The constant presence of the poet philosopher that was called the obscure. He had nothing of obscure, I tell you. All high poetry, I believe, has invariably attempted such a penetrating and also transforming intervention into reality. Not to be content with the here and now, but to expand into the what can be achieved. And this, it is true, has not always been valued. Perhaps because collective neurosis did not permit it. Perhaps because utilitarianism did not let men's eyes open sufficiently. Or because beauty and light, and these are two things that are constantly equaled in this poetry, because beauty and light were considered passé or painless. Nevertheless, the process required to reach an angel's shape is, I believe, much more painful than the process that brings to being demons of all kinds. For me, his poems are in many ways allied to the poetry of such other great European or Latin American contemporaries as Jorge Guillén or Luis Cernuda in Spain, René Char, Camus in France, César Vallejo. I was going to say in Peru, but really we must say in France, Peru, or Boris Pasternak in Russia. These poets have found new sources of individual human dignity and creative freedom without committing themselves to any ideologically restrictive utopian dogma. The experience of their poetry liberates the reader. And I would like to end reading two poems in both English and Spanish. Is that okay? Let me see which ones I should choose from the ones that I from the monogram, I'm going to read the fourth poem of the monogram, first in English and then in Spanish. It is too early yet in this world. Hear me? The monsters have not yet been tame. Hear me? My lost blood and the pointed, hear me, knife like a ram that runs amid the skies and snaps the bugs of the stars. Hear me? It's I. Hear me? I love you. Hear me? I hold you and lead you and dress you in Ophelia's white bridal gown. Hear me? Where do you leave me? Where are you going? And who, hear me, holds your hand over the flats? The day will come, hear me, the enormous lianas and the lava of volcanoes will bury us, and thousands of years later, hear me, they will make us luminous fossils, hear me, for the heartlessness of men to shine, hear me, over them, and throw us away in thousands of pieces, hear me, in the waters one by one, hear me. I count my bitter pebbles, hear me, and time is a great church, hear me, where sometime the figures, hear me, of saints weep real tears, hear me. The bells open on high, hear me, a deep passage for me to pass through. The angels wait with candles and funeral psalms. I go nowhere, hear me. Either no one or we two together, hear me. This flower of tempest and, hear me, of love, once and for always we carried, hear me, and it cannot come into bloom otherwise, hear me, in another earth, in another star, hear me. The soil, the very air we touch are no more, hear me. And no gardener was so fortunate in other times to put forth a flower amid such a winter, hear me. And such north winds, only we, hear me. In the middle of the sea, from only the wish for love, hear me. Raise the whole island, hear me. With caves and flowering cliffs. Listen, listen, who speaks to the waters and who weeps? Here? Who seeks the other, who cries out? Here? It is I who cry out, and it is I who weep. Hear me. I love you. I love you. Hear me.
Perhaps the other one in English also, because we're running out of time.
Okay.
So just do it in English.
Okay, so just in English, or we just read the one in Spanish and forget about the second poem.
It's up to you, but
Let me read the poem in Spanish, okay? Okay? And I'll read a little faster. Thank you very much, Georgette, for letting me know that. El monograma. No, I shouldn't read fast. Poetry cannot be read fast. So I'll read just in Spanish, but I'll read it at its pace.
Take your time.
Es temprano todavía en este mundo. ¿Me oyes? No han sido domesticados los monstruos, ¿me oyes? Mi sangre perdida y el aguzado, ¿me oyes? Puñal que corre como carnero por los cielos y quiebra la rama de las estrellas, ¿me oyes? Soy yo, ¿me oyes? Te amo, ¿me oyes? Te tengo y te llevo y te visto con el blanco traje nupcial de Ofelia, ¿me oyes? ¿Dónde me dejas? ¿A dónde vas? ¿Y quién? ¿Me oyes? Te toma de la mano por encima de los diluvios. Enormes lianas y lava de volcanes, llegará el día, ¿me oyes?, en que nos entierren y miles de años después, ¿me oyes?, nos convertirán en rocas brillantes, ¿me oyes?, para que sobre ellas luzca la crueldad, me oyes, humana, y en 5000 añicos nos arrojará, me oyes, a las aguas uno a uno, me oyes, mis amargos guijarros cuento, me oyes, y es el tiempo una iglesia, me oyes, donde a veces en las imágenes, me oyes, de los santos, surgen lágrimas verdaderas, me oyes, y las campanas abren en lo alto, me oyes, un hondo pasaje que permita mi paso, aguardan los ángeles con cirios y fúnebres salmos, no voy a ninguna parte, me oyes, o ninguno, o los dos juntos, me oyes. Esta flor de la tormenta y me oyes, del amor, de una vez para siempre la cortamos, me oyes, y no habrá de florecer de otra manera, me oyes, en otra tierra, en otra estrella, me oyes. No existe el suelo, no existe el mismo aire, me oyes, que tocábamos, me oyes. Y ningún jardinero tuvo la dicha en otros tiempos. Después de tanto invierno y tantos vientos fríos, ¿me oyes? Que nazca una flor, solo nosotros, ¿me oyes? Levantamos toda una isla, ¿me oyes? Con grutas y cabos y acantilados florecidos. Oye, oye, ¿quién habla a las aguas y quién llora? ¿Oyes? ¿Quién busca al otro? ¿Quién grita? ¿Oyes? Soy yo que grito, soy yo que lloro. ¿Me oyes? Te amo. Te amo. ¿Me oyes? Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. And I want to tell you all that both poets, Pedro and Rey, have been recorded for the Library of Congress by the Hispanic Division. We have an archive of recorded literature. So it was with great pride that we also have recorded most of the authors that Pedro mentioned, like Segovia, Montemayor, and all the others. And I would like to introduce Harry Like from the European Division, who will field the questions from the audience. Harry Like, he's the Greek and Russian specialist for the European Division.
Thank you, Georgette. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to speak very briefly about the Greek collections at the Library of Congress, and then hopefully we have some time for questions and answers from the audience. In preparing the exhibit that Georgette mentioned at the Greek Embassy in December, I was really struck by the number of Spanish translations of Elytis compared with other Greek authors. And it I mentioned it to Georgette, and we kind of batted around the idea so that was kind of the origin of this program. And I haven't really had a chance to grapple with the implications of it, but it's an interesting example because it turns out the interest went the other direction too. For example, noted Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca was translated into Greek fairly rapidly, fairly soon after he was, especially his trilogy, his famed trilogy, Blood Wedding, Yerma, and The House of Bernarda Alba were published. They appeared in Greek, which again is interesting and shows a kind of a very intriguing cross-fertilization of these two Mediterranean cultures that I think should really be looked into further. Again, I've not had time to really do it. Georgette mentioned my Russian connection. My own principal expertise and competence is in Russian and Slavic studies, and as illogical as it may seem to also be covering Greece, when you think about it, it really isn't, because Russia was originally, more than 1,000 years ago, Russia was civilized and Christianized by a Greek civilization, by Byzantium. So there really is a direct connection there, which is interesting. And speaking about, I'm intrigued with this idea of translation that you both brought up, because the Russians have just published a wonderful complete Kavafis in Russian translation, and the translations are fantastic. So I've been, since 1997, I've been responsible for developing the Greek collections, the modern Greek collections, that is, and helping people use them for their research, whatever that research may be. And of course, with the Russian connection, there's also many shared features, the Orthodox religion, for example. Our modern Greek collections are probably the largest in the United States. That's probably a safe statement to say about any country's collections. The only possible competitor would be the library at Harvard University. While Thomas Jefferson was not literally the founder of the Library of Congress, which dates back to 1800, he's considered in some sense the father of the Library of Congress. And his own personal library had a few modern Greek books in it. And those are now on display. The entire library, to the extent that it's been reconstructed, is on display in the Jefferson Building. And I would invite you to look at that. There's also very interesting correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and Greek Adamandios Korais. Just immediately before and during the period of Greek independence in the 1820s, they corresponded on Korais asking Jefferson for ideas on how a new democratic state could and should be set up. And it was, in fact, in 1821 that Greece, the first part of Greece, of what is now Greece, became independent. And that correspondence, unfortunately, has not been completely published. It's in the Korais archives on the island of Chios in the Aegean. And the really serious collecting of modern Greek materials began in the 1930s, when the library finally, instead of concentrating just on the big countries of the world, started to become really, truly global in its collecting from around the world. So I think I'll skip over some of my notes here. We don't exist as a collection in isolation. We collaborate with other American libraries. We collaborate with a number of libraries and archives in Greece itself, in Cyprus. And for example, I'm in communication on a fairly regular basis with my counterparts at particularly other American libraries. And we're able to help each other and help each other's readers in their research. And so our collections are open to everybody. If you've not used them, I would invite you to use the Greek collections and to use the Hispanic collections and the Russian collections of the Library of Congress for your research. So thank you. And now we have, I think, some time for questions. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to say anything?
I would like to congratulate both poets for the excellent presentation, and actually the library for the initiative in organizing this event. And I would like to invite participants who for the first time have a contact with the Greek poet, to ask questions and have the right answers from these two poets and professors.
Thank you.
You mentioned something very interesting of your, say, kind of surprise that Garcia Lorca would that the trilogy of.
The microphone fixed. Why just after the microphone both?
Can you hear me? I think that.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
Oh, for
Do
the.
we need
Oh,
it
I'm
for the
sorry.
web?
Yes. Yeah.
Steady the microphone both.
Oh, there are two microphones here, so we can use one. No, you mentioned before the sort of a surprise that the trilogy of Federico Garcia Lorca, Blood Wedding, Yerma, and Bernarda Alba, was translated soon into Greek. And I think that that's understandable for one very, very clear reason. When you read those plays, obviously García Lorca places the three of them as dramas de las mujeres del campo en España. But you could say exactly the same thing if you, instead of España, say drama de las mujeres del campo in Greece, drama de las mujeres del campo in Italy. It's amazing how García Lorca was able to capture the pains and tribulations of women in the countryside in such a manner that anyone reading or attending to performances of those plays will think that he would be talking about their own countryside women.
Yes, I agree. That's a very interesting comment.
You mentioned that Greek poetry has been translated more than any other. Why do you think that is?
Repeat her question so I didn't pick it up.
Why has Greek poetry been translated more than any other literatures?
You want to answer?
Well,
We can do a la limón.
into yes, into Spanish or I think that it's not only. I think that there are some countries that have that particular experience. One is Greece, and the other one is Poland. No, there are Polish poets are translated into English and into Spanish in a way that no poets from Indonesia have been translated. And I think that, for example, in Spanish and in Mexico is because of that, but also I think that one of the Elytis was translated Lorca, that is the only Spanish poet that he translated, and he was first as surrealist, but as you mentioned, Alexandre was a surrealist, or Cernuda was a surrealist, but in a way that was not dogmatic. Yeah. And I think that kind of shifting from dogmatism in Elytis was parallel as a shifting from dogmatism in Latin American and Spanish poetry during the same time. No, that happened to Borges. That happened to even Neruda. The poems that Neruda was writing at the time, were kind of complex, surrealist, and avant-garde poetry, but that incorporated other possibilities of reading that were not detached from reality. No, I think that's. I don't know if you want.
Yeah. I think also that there is another thing that might be added to this. We have always had interest in Greece. I think that the Western civilization knows very well where our roots are. And no matter how much the religious world wants to insist taking us away from Greece, we come from a humanistic experience, ho anthropos metron panton. And that humanistic experience is the one that maintains the flame of love in anything that is Greek, present in our societies. It's fading little by little because of the language and makes it harder, but it fades in a way that, but it's still a lot of interest because our society. I see my students going around with wires attached to their ears. It's like it's the wire. We live in a wire society.
Why don't we have spare the time for having?
Yeah. So, I think that it has always been alive, and that has created that interest.
Okay, one more question.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes. Yes, why don't you come up?
Yeah.
Since you're close.
Well, to thank you very much for this wonderful event. I'm not close. Okay, so I need to be closer.
Speak right into it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Costa Makrodimidis. Actually, I grew up in Greece, and I had the opportunity to get trained with Elytis and Seferis, and appreciate all the good words and everything. I have a couple of comments to make, and also to ask a question to our professors here. First of all, behind Elytis' poetry, there was kind of a philosophy that he actually published. I think it's called Open Papers. So there is a philosophy behind all that. And I think you mentioned several times it's a lot about the lights and the natural elements. He loved the sun, and but this wasn't just only the one the dimension, because he wanted to complement the natural elements with the ethics, with ethical kind of principles, and at the end he created something like a modern mythology for the Greeks. So Theodorakis took the action st and made this oratorio. So he created something that probably Greece needs more than ever now, for example. My question is, how you classify his poetry? Some people say this is a kind of modern, romantic, kind of modern romanticism. What is the genre, and who do you believe are the poets that follow him in the later years, let's say 90s and until now? So how do you classify how we can remember in the poetry history, of course, his contribution, but also what genre is that? What kind of name we should give? Just can we remember some on that? Thank you very much.
I'll let Pedro talk because I already spoke 2 times.
Okay. Well, I think he said, for example, I mentioned that that Greece was for him the world, no? And it's very interesting, because one of the poets that have written in English about him is Caroline Forget, and she compares the world in she was born, that was in the snow, to the sun in Elytis. And there is another critic who compares him with Wallace Stevens. And immediately I imagined the snow. Well, I would say that the snow in Stevens is the equivalent of the sun in Elytis. And when you were saying who's the poet that can be related to him, I would say that the last Nobel Prize, Transtromer, is a poet that can be compared to him. Octavio Paz with Piedra de Sol, I mean, the poets that came afterward him. And I would say that also Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, in the way he relates to the land, to the country, to the myth, and to recovering all those things to put something that is contemporary and present. And I think that what Elytis does is contemporary and present to us.
Yeah. Good. Sorry.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.